Recording in progress.
Welcome to the Philippine Science Heritage Center's new Salinlahi Science Center, honoring our top Filipino scientists and their game-changing contributions to the world of science. Know more about all of them and let the Salinlahi Science Center be your gateway into their minds. Salinlahi.
Are you ready for the new Transactions NASFIL? The Transactions NASFIL ISIS N01158848 has been published by the National Academy of Science and Technology Philippines since 1979. Traditionally, published papers presented during the NASFIL's annual scientific meeting to promote science-based policy discussions of and recommendations on timely and relevant national issues as part of its functions as a national science academy. Starting with Volume 43, this journal is now open to contributions from the global scientific community in all fields and will be subjected to double-blind peer review. Accepted papers will be published in the Transactions NASFIL website. And here is a quick preview of the website. The papers for the journal include conference proceedings such as messages, plenary papers, resolutions of ASM, etc., perspectives, articles including review and feature articles, biographical or autobiographical essays of NAS members and other outstanding Filipino scientists. The papers will be uploaded as soon as they are approved for publication. Take note that all papers are downloadable. You can also zoom in or out depending on your liking. The backlog starting 2016 will also be published soon. The Transactions NASFIL will be a key platform for the timely release of advisory documents of NASFIL as part of its advisory functions. Let's make a timely and relevant Transactions NASFIL. Collaborate with us by visiting transactions.nas.ph or email us at publications@nas.usp.gov.ph.
Before we begin, please be reminded of our house rules. Proper decorum is expected among all participants. Any act of disrespect and rudeness shall not be tolerated throughout the duration of the webinar. Kindly key in your questions for the panelists in the Q&A. These will be answered during the open forum.
Magandang umaga po sa lahat. On behalf of the National Academy of Science and Technology Philippines and the Microbiology Consortium of the Philippines, or MCP, I am pleased to welcome you all to the first of the three-part series of the focus group discussions on microbes and climate change. I am academician Windel Rivera, member of the Biological Sciences Division of NAST Philippines and the chair of the MCP. I will be the moderator for today's FGD. Now, for everyone's information, the MCP of the Philippine Society for Microbiology is an organization of higher education institutions, or HEIs, in the Philippines. And these HEIs are offering undergraduate as well as graduate microbiology programs. The MCP is committed to the promotion of excellence and ethics in the practice of microbiology in the country. Now, one of its activities is the conduct of monthly webinar for its member HEIs. The MCP partnered with NAST Philippines for this three-part series of FGDs on microbes and climate change. Well, let your friends know that you are attending this activity. Please use the official hashtags, hashtag PhilippineNAST and hashtag microbes and climate change. Now, a few reminders before we start. Kindly key in your questions in the Q&A box.
Mitigation and adaptation will be discussed by our esteemed speakers. With this, I would like to thank Dr. James T.G., academician, Juan Pulin, Dr. Kathleen Aviso, Dr. Deo Florence Onda, corresponding member Francis de los Reyes, Dr. Pierre Angeli Vital, and Dr. Glenn Xia Su for accepting our invitation to share their time and expertise in this very significant and timely activity. My sincere gratitude also to the organizing committee headed by Academician Asuncion Raimundo and members Academician Virginia Cuevas, Academician Wendell Rivera, and corresponding member Francis de los Reyes III for spearheading this activity. Let me extend the Academy's appreciation to all of you who have given your time to attend this activity. I look forward to the excellent presentations and fruitful discussions during the open forum. Thank you and a pleasant morning to everyone. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Academician Asansa. Now, to give us a brief overview of the discussion and also to introduce our invited speakers, let us hear from Academician Asuncion K. Raimundo, Chair of the Organizing Committee of this FGD and member of the Biological Sciences Division of NAST. Academician Raimundo, the virtual floor is now yours.
Good morning, everyone. We all know that coping with this changing planet is perhaps the greatest challenge humanity is confronted with in the 21st century and beyond. Stronger typhoons, erratic rainfall patterns, rising coastal water levels, frequent wildfires, animal migration, more destructive epidemics, and many more disturbing occurrences have emerged. All of these have been attributed to climate change, which is precipitated by global warming. In these occurrences, microorganisms, being the most abundant life form on Earth, play an important role in climate regulations, as they are major drivers of elemental cycling: carbon, nitrogen, sulfur. They are also important consumers of carbon, especially in the marine environment, and producers of greenhouse gases in the terrestrial environment. They are also key pathogens of humans, animals, and plants. Human activities, especially agriculture and transport systems, have greatly disturbed the balance of elemental cycling, resulting in the release of more greenhouse gases to the environment, exacerbating global warming, contributing to climate change. The Philippines, due to its geographical location and as an archipelagic country, is considered as one of the most vulnerable countries in the world affected by climate change. It is therefore necessary for Filipinos to understand the role of microbes in climate change as we undertake adaptive and mitigating measures. There is a need to incorporate microbial sciences in current and future climate change initiatives and remediation processes to lessen the impact of climate change to our lives. In this FGD, it is expected that the various presentations will help concerned stakeholders, researchers, teachers, professors, policymakers become aware of the role of microbes in climate change. Recommendations can be made so microbes will be considered in inactivity on climate change, especially adaptation and mitigation. This is the first of a series of FGDs in this topic of microbes and climate change. In the pipeline is the second FGD on microbes and climate change in the terrestrial and marine environment to be held in January 2023. The third one will be on microbes and climate change as affecting humans and our health. This will all be co-sponsored with the Microbiology Consortium of the Philippines. Now for today's FGD, we are fortunate to have as our main speaker, Dr. James T.G., University Distinguished Professor of Michigan State University, and the lead convener of the American Society of Microbiology Colloquium on Microbes and Climate Change. He's going to share with us an overview on this topic. I now have the pleasure of introducing him and also of the other two speakers. Dr. TG is a University Distinguished Professor and Director of the Center for Microbial Ecology, Department of Plant, Soil, and Microbial Sciences, Michigan State University. He earned his BS from Iowa State University and his MS and PhD from Cornell University. His laboratory focuses on understanding the ecology, physiology, and biochemistry of microbial processes important in nature and of value to industry. His research is focused on microbial ecology, studying interactions between microbes, their environments, and plant and animal species. His work includes understanding biodegradation of environmental pollutants and the use of molecular methods to understand microbial community structure and function. Dr. TG and his colleagues discovered soil microbes that dechlorinate fluorine aromatic compounds that can help degrade toxic chemicals such as polychlorinated biphenyls and dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane. Dr. TG was president of the American Society for Microbiology and the International Society of Microbial Ecology. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Microbiology, American Association of the Advancement of Science, the Ecological Society of America, the Soil Science Society of America, and a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. He is the former editor-in-chief of several ASM journals, including Applied and Environmental Microbiology, and was the director of the Center for Microbial Ecology for 30 years. But before we go to the main topic, we will listen first to an update on climate change research in the Philippines. And to give us the updates is academician John Pulhin. He is a member of the Social Sciences Division of NASD and currently the co-chair of NAS Task Force on Climate Change. He is also a professor and former dean of the College of Forestry and Natural Resources, University of the Philippines. Academician Pulhin is recognized for his pioneering work in the development of participatory approaches to climate risk, vulnerability, and adaptation, including the integration of science and local knowledge. His groundbreaking research in social forestry and forest governance steered policy reforms in community-based forest management and forest rehabilitation programs in the country. He's a co-recipient of numerous national and international awards, foremost of which was his contribution to the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize Award, shared by the members of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, with former U.S. Vice President Al Gore. After the talk of Dr. TG, we will hear about the network modeling and climate change work done by the De La Salle University, to be presented by Dr. Kathleen Apiso. If you have seen the poster, Dr. Raymond Tan is listed as the speaker. However, due to a pressing assignment given to him on short notice, he has to leave for a mission as the representative of the LSU president. Thus, Dr. Aviso, a very able speaker too, a co-worker of Dr. Tan, will do representation of their work. Dr. Aviso is a university fellow and a professor of the Department of Chemical Engineering at De La Salle University. She is the current dean of the Gokeng Wei College of Engineering of the university. Her main research interest is the development of decision support tools for environmental decision-making. She earned her PhD degree in industrial engineering from De La Salle University. She is a well-published scientist and is currently an executive editor of the Journal of Cleaner Production and part of the editorial board of several international journals published by Elsevier and Springer Nature. She is a well-published scientist. She is the author of the book Input-Output Models for Sustainable Industrial Systems. For her scientific work, Prof. Aviso has received multiple scientific awards from government and professional organizations in the Philippines. Thank you, and back to you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much, Academician Raimundo. Okay, so we can now begin. To give us updates on climate change, we would like to listen to Academician Juan Pulhin. Academician Pulhin.
Thank you very much, fellow academicians, and good morning to everyone. Let me share my screen. So my presentation is about some updates on climate change, and I look at the global, but also at the local context. And by covering the following three topics. First, I will be drawing much on the recent IPCC 6 assessment report, both at the global and regional level, where I had the opportunity to participate on writing. I will then move to a couple of slides on the new insights drawn from the 10 new insights on climate science, which was actually launched in the recent COP 27 held in Egypt, again, of which I had the privilege to be a co-author. And finally, I will zoom in the case of the impacts of climate change in the Philippines. But of course, let me said on the outset that the focus of my presentation is more on the ecosystems, but particularly on the human dimensions of climate change, and leave, of course, the very interesting topic to our keynote speaker on the issue of climate change and microorganisms. So let me start by saying that when we talk about climate change and its impacts, we're talking about actually two aspects. One is what we call historical and actual observation, meaning to say that these are really based on observational evidences that is record either in the past or currently at present. So that's one dimension. The other dimension is what we call as the projected impacts. And that benefits from the advances in science. So you, on the basis of different scenarios, you employ climate modeling, and then you are able to look into the future using different scenarios to project several impacts. So in my presentation, I look at both the observed and projected impacts on climate change, both at the global and local level. So let me start, and this is from the recent Working Group 2 IPCC 6 assessment report, of which one of the primary conclusion is that there is actually a widespread and pervasive impacts of climate change to ecosystems and human systems based on actual historical observations. So climate change causes substantial damages and increasing irreversible losses in terms of terrestrial, freshwater, and coastal and even open ocean marine ecosystems. And as you can see in this particular diagram here, practically across different continents in the world, terrestrial ecosystem, as well as the marine and ocean ecosystems, are among the most adversely affected with high level of confidence. So in climate change science, particularly in the language of IPCC, when we say high level of confidence, then you are almost sure that a certain change in phenomenon, such as the destruction, for instance, of the terrestrial and marine ecosystems, can really be significantly attributed to the changing climate. So in terms of the different sectors, three important sectors in human systems are heavily impacted by climate change. And again, it includes water scarcity and food production, with medium confidence, health and well-being, again, high confidence, as well as cities, settlements, and infrastructure also receiving a very high confidence. And again, this is actually based on historical observation. So let's now look into the future. As far as Asian context is concerned, then essentially we look at impacts to ecosystems and the different sectors, particularly in terrestrial, freshwater ecosystems, ocean ecosystems, as well as health. And as indicated here, when we talk about terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, there is a high risk attributed for this ecosystem beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade climate temperature change. And that's primarily the reason why we are actually, particularly the Paris Agreement, is targeting a maximum of temperature increase of 1.5 degrees centigrade, because beyond that, we will see a lot of irreversible impacts. In terms of ocean ecosystems, high risk beyond 2 degrees centigrade is also projected. For health, there is high risk beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade that can impact limit the adaptation process. Each year, a group of scientists produce what they call as 10 new insights on climate science. And I also draw from that particular, report, which was launched at the COP27 recently. And one of the key findings of that is there is a compounding and cascading risks due to climate change that adversely impact on human, animal, and environmental health. In fact, the same report stressed that 40% of the heat-related deaths are actually associated with a changing climate. Outbreaks of infectious diseases is anticipated to increase, probably including the incidence of COVID-19 and several variations. Wildfire is also anticipated to increase as a result of increase in temperature and drought. And all of these are also anticipated to have adverse impact on the physical and mental conditions of human beings, which as a result of the different climate-related stressors are expected to decline. Let me focus now in terms of another human dimension, interesting dimension is it is anticipated that there will be increasing incidences and intensification of extreme weather events coupled with slow onset impacts of climate change that will heighten involuntary migration and displacement. So in many parts of the world, there will be population movement. Much of the movement may be attributed to the changing climate. In fact, our record indicates that more than 88, close to 90% of population movement and migration is actually related to weather disturbances. Another sad news is that in climate change, we talk about two major responses. One is mitigation and the other one is adaptation. And of course, at the global level, we are trying to address the adaptation by reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. and sequestering carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as well. But in the aspects of adaptation, there is increasing materials that indicates that there is now limits to adaptation, and that limit is actually being breached already in different places across the world. And so we talk about, when we talk about limits to adaptation, we talk about soft limits. That is a situation, a current situation where we don't have yet a well-defined action that will be able to reduce the adverse impact, but potential adaptation strategies may still be available in the future. However, when we talk about hard limits, then we have already achieved the threshold, and essentially, it's almost impossible to do something about a particular situation. So, examples of breach indicates that there are essentially extreme heat directly threatening human life, and also even the cases of sea level rise that impacts on coastal communities are examples of breaching that limits to adaptation. One of the recent discussion also is on losses and damages associated with the changing climate. It says here losses and damages are happening globally, which are projected to increase dramatically, including that of the Philippines. And in terms of the human dimensions, losses and damage are really hitting most vulnerable communities, particularly the poorest countries, to experience the adverse impact of climate change, including the Philippines. And only rapid mitigation and effective adaptation has the potential to prevent climate-induced losses and damages. Let's now zoom in into the case of the Asian region. Asia, of course, as we all know, is the most vulnerable region, and the International Disaster Database that we draw from, that provides information from early as 1900 to 2021 indicates that out of the 16,132 total world disasters that is attributed to hydrometeorological disasters, meaning climate-related disasters, 6,493 of those, or 40.30%, actually happened in Asia. And here is a summary of the observed climate change impacts in Asia, which has been attributed, or with high attribution to climate impact drivers, ranging from heat waves to coastal urban flooding to biodiversity and habitat loss, dust storms, sea level rise, urban heat island effect, permafrost thawing, wildfire, and so on and so forth, including urban drought and even flood-induced damages. And of course, agriculture also is one of the adversely affected sector as far as these climate-induced drivers are concerned. If we look into the future, the situation will not be improving, not unless, again, there is major intervention or collective action that the whole world will pursue. In the Asian context, climate change is projected to have adverse impacts and effects in various sectors, such as in the agriculture sector, in health, in economy, in water, and in ecosystems, again, based on recent climate science, using the science of climate projection using different scenarios. The context in the Philippines is even dimmer. So at your right is a simulated typhoon path that the UPRI have documented starting in the 1950s up until 2013. And you can see in here that almost the whole map of the Philippines has been erased because of the series of typhoons that land in the Philippine area of responsibility. And the 21 Global Climate Risk Index ranked Philippines as the most affected countries of the world among the more than 190, I think 194 countries, UN member countries, that is from the year 2000 to 2019, and we rank fourth as the most adversely affected. In terms of the future, more than mere environmental challenge, climate change has an economic, sociopolitical, and even security issue that will continue to expose vulnerabilities across sectors in the Philippines. Mean temperature in the Philippines are projected to rise significantly under all models except for the most optimistic scenario, which is nonetheless not likely to happen considering current situation, as well as the number of days with extreme temperature is also anticipated to increase, and these have adverse impacts on the different sectors, including agriculture, health, and the other sectors, including the economy. Actual observation based on the records of the Department of Finance, and this is a one-decade record, indicated that losses and damages due to natural calamities rank or reached to as much as 506.1 billion pesos. And annual average loss in terms of GDP due to climate events alone has been estimated by the Department of Finance at 48.9 billion. Again, the future is even bleak if not much significant strategy is adopted. So heightening intensity and incidences of extreme events and productivity, and this is reflected on the figure on the left, losses could lead to substantial economic damages, which can amount to 7.6% and 13.6% reduction in the country's gross domestic product by 2030 and 2040, respectively. And in terms of poverty impact, as well as equity or inequality, Filipinos will be disproportionately affected by climate change, especially in the poverty-stricken localities and among poverty-stricken individuals, bearing the brunt of its impacts based on 2040 recent World Bank Climate and Development Report just published less than a month ago. And as indicated here, the different high poverty areas in the Philippines with high environmental risk, ranging from flood to storm hotspots, will suffer the most, with an anticipated or projected impacts on the rate of poverty to increase by 1% by 2040, inequality by 0.3%, and even economic insecurity by 3.3%, again, if nothing drastic and strategic adaptation strategy is pursued. In terms of human health, and I think this is one of my last few slides, human health is directly and indirectly affected by climate change as well. And again, the latest science indicates that Southeast Asia is one of the likely to be adversely affected, particularly by increase by heat, increase in temperature, and it's anticipated that the number of mortality, excess mortality in Southeast Asia as a result of heat, increasing temperature and heat is actually estimated close to 13%. And then malaria and dengue and other waterborne diseases are actually also expected to be impacted by climate change. And in the Philippines, heat-related deaths that is associated with a changing climate is actually anticipated at 61%. So, in conclusion, and of course, I focus belonging to the social science division of NAS. I focus more, as you can observe, on the human dimensions of climate change. I wish to echo one of the key insights from the 10 new insights in climate science that alluded to the fact that human security requires climate security. And a call for action, and I wish to quote from the former US President Barack Obama, "We are the first generation to feel the effects of climate change and the last generation who can do something about it." Again, thank you very much for listening and good day, everyone.
Thank you very much, Academician Pulhin, for that very informative talk. Now we move on to the next talk and to discuss the overall perspective on microbes and climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. James Tiji. Dr. Tiji, please.
Yes, just a moment and I'll share my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So I really appreciated the comments of Academician Pulhin because he sits on the IPCC, which is a very important place to be with regard to understanding and having action for climate issues. Our group at the American Society of Microbiology recognized that if you look through the IPCC reports, there's almost no direct mention of microbes. However, microbial activities as a group function are, of course, mentioned in the report. But the group at the American Society of Microbiology thought perhaps there could be more done with regard to recognizing the role of microbes and how understanding their role could lead to better mitigation or sustainability. So this is an overview, and this is a summary statement that I provided to them just a few weeks ago that is my main point. Microbes produce and consume the three major greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. So it's the microbiologist's challenge to understand and manage these microbial processes where possible to minimize climate change. So it is an opportunity and perhaps even a need for microbiologists to consider where they can contribute to knowledge and to action. I also, on the right-hand side, point out two primary references. One is the colloquium report by ASM, which I'll draw most of my material from. And then a paper in which about 6 of us who were on the 31-member colloquium committee wrote for and published in MBio. So you see the citation there. That is a more limited report, but it also tries to at least give perspectives for action by microbiologists in several sector areas. So we're all very familiar with these kinds of figures. These are the increase in the 3 greenhouse gases. This is from an IPCC report of 20 years ago, but the direction has continued. So there's no question that those gases are increasing in the atmosphere, and their global warming potential is, of course, very significant. Also, again, focusing on those 3 gases, this is the estimate of the carbon dioxide production sources, most of them, of course, being from fossil fuels, but for some other sources as well. But again, pointing out that those are the 3 major gases, and they're all microbial products and microbial substrates as well. If we look at each of them individually, this is CO2, the largest portion from transportation, second from electricity, industry being the 3rd production, and then some other sources. So what's the microbial role relative to CO2? So on the left-hand side, as you well know, microbes oxidize organic carbon to CO2, wherever that organic carbon is. And there are certain environments in which there's a major portion of the microbes producing CO2, some of which can be better managed. So soil tillage, deforestation, waste treatment, permafrost thaw are big examples of where microbial production of CO2 has been increasing. But microbes also play a role with biofuels. And biofuels, of course, can be used in the conversion to liquid fuel. Microbes also aid plant growth. They fix nitrogen, which aids plant growth, and they're very important to soil structure, which is important to overall productivity. At the bottom, I point out, as you well know, microbes also do produce electric current. Unfortunately, not a large amount of current, but it can be an auxiliary source of power in some locations. Now, with regard to methane, these would be the different sources of methane by emission. And here there are 3 sectors which are microbial production: from manures, from landfills, and from enteric fermentations. So methane, in contrast to CO2, is the case where understanding and managing microbes can lead to an important reductions in methane production. And the 3rd gas is nitrous oxide. And here, much of it comes from agricultural soils and depends upon the management of those soils. It comes from the microbial processes of denitrification and nitrification. And it is an area in which I think major management impacts can reduce that production. Some also comes from manure and wastewater, as I point out, that those are microbial sources as well. So if we summarize, then methane and nitrous oxide are two of the gases in which microbial management can effectively reduce those productions for the atmosphere. Now, so key features of these gases. So the largest gas in terms of emission would be CO2, followed by methane and by nitrous oxide. But their half-life is very different. And the shortest half-life is methane. So in terms of making an impact on an important global warming gas, methane is maybe the sweet spot. Its global warming potential is much higher, about 25 to 30 times higher than CO2. And nitrous oxide is a small component, but its lifetime is longer. but its global warming potential is much, much, much higher. So with increased microbial management of those two gases, there could be a major impact on global warming potential. Now to the report. So this report is available on the ASM site. It's quite a substantive report, well referenced, some 60 pages. So I encourage you to have a look at this, thinking about then what the understanding the microbes can do. So the report is organized into these categories. So this is a big topic, as you all know. So how do we break it down into reasonable components and then put them back together, because a lot of components within them overlap. So from the environmental perspective, we consider three: terrestrial, aquatic, and urban. So the terrestrial, of course, has many types. Agriculture, forestry, polar, and deserts would be the big three. And some of those are influenced by human management, some by natural conditions. The aquatic environment includes 70% of the surface of Earth, most of it being in oceans, but also intertidal areas, rivers, and lakes are all also important aquatic components. And then in the urban environment, then we have an impact in which microbes are important on infrastructure, especially corrosion, where higher humidity, flooding, sulfate reducers have a big impact on corrosion of infrastructure. Flooding itself is an important factor for not only moisture, fungal organisms, sewage overflow then often becomes a part of that, and then pathogens can escape, and antibiotic resistant organisms can escape, and maybe horizontal gene exchange making new pathogens, and a variety of cascading effects in the urban environment. Also, the term we use is microbial injustice, which Puhan referred to as disadvantaged people receiving more impact of climate issues, and especially of infectious diseases. And cascading effects then are very prominent in the urban environment as well. So those are the three environmental categories. Then there are other categories that are important, of course, and one is human health. Those include zoonotic spillovers, that changing range of vector organisms. Pathogens are often favored in these environments, especially where there's more moisture and flooding. And then breaking the endothermal barrier, that being that humans have a higher temperature than desired for most microbes, and that then is a barrier for their success. But some microbes, including some fungi, are getting higher temperature tolerances, so they're breaking through that endothermal barrier, then allowing more infectious conditions. A second category is human well-being, and that's primarily food security, food safety, water safety and quality, as well as air quality as well. Those are all factors that can be influenced by climate, certainly by temperature, as well as change in humidity and rainfall conditions, and disease-causing organisms, especially being a problem for food plants in more humid environments. And another category is models and data systems. So how do we put this information together in a useful manner? And certainly at the large scale, climate modelers have been very active for many decades in trying to understand the climate system and make projections. How can microbial information better inform those models? And this is a really challenging topic area because microbes are at the smallest scale, and one needs to then move to larger scales. So a real challenge is scaling microbial information over time and space, and then also understanding microbial feedbacks that then influence these models. And then the final sector that is discussed is microbes and the bioeconomy. That's to provide thoughts towards solutions. And how can this be a more winning situation from an economy point of view? So what are the barriers to innovation in using microbial systems? And how can microbes better enable the circular economy? So those are the categories in which the ASM Academy report deals with. So there are many kinds of figures that show integration of systems, but that is what microbes are, part of an integrated system. They're in the terrestrial environments of many types, from arid to very wet. They extend, of course, into the aquatic environment. And in all of those environments, they produce and consume these greenhouse gases. So what are the conditions in which those productions or consumptions are favored, and can we manage some of those? So human health is one factor, of course, and one of recent notoriety is, of course, spillover, zoological spillover. So from wild animals to domestic animals to humans, or in all three directions. So there can be positive spillovers and there can be spillbacks. And in each of these, the organisms then can readapt, do some genetic exchange, and create new versions that can spill over again. So as climate changes, populations grow, travel, they're all drivers of land degradation and habitat loss, which leads to more interactions between these different animal sectors and the organisms they carry, some of which cause disease. So that's certainly an important topic area. So there are many cascading effects and different effects, and this is one example of those many effects and the various outcomes. So on the left-hand side, you can see the altered attributes due to climate change, such as virulent, geographic range, dispersal, host susceptibility, exposure through trauma and wounds, and vectors. And then examples given with emerging fungal pathogens as a result of those altered attributes. And then on the right-hand side, the consequences of those to food security, to human and animal health, and to wildlife extinction or effects. So it's the climate's impacts on temperature, precipitation, and frequency and severity of storms that leads to these kinds of changes in the host and vector susceptibilities. Now moving to other examples, potential impacts of climate on food security, extremely important worldwide and becoming more so every year with increased population and more pressure on land use. And so at the bottom, it indicates the symbols for climate impact factors, such as relative humidity, temperature, precipitation events, salinity, acidification, and how they interact these different sectors, such as agriculture, animal production, fisheries, food storage, and food products. So you can see that there are a number of interacting effects that directly relate to this human well-being component being food security. Now the modeling area as I indicated, is a particularly challenging one for microbes. Models are meant to scale over time and space. And adding microbes to those models is extremely challenging because it begins at the smallest scale. This is an example from a publication of David et al. In 2022, indicating how different advanced modeling approaches, including deep learning approaches, can be used to better analyze data and perhaps provide better outcomes. But I have been involved in some research projects with groups that have attempted to use microbial information to improve predictions of different microbial processes at a larger scale. And I would just summarize saying that is extremely challenging, but that is what the next generation can do. Now, moving on to this circular bioeconomy. So the idea here is to reutilize resources. And from a fundamental perspective, once carbon and nitrogen are fixed into organic compounds, from an energetic point of view, from a waste point of view, it makes much more sense to reutilize those. So that's what the circular economy is. How can one do that with a number of different products? And this would show a schematic type, or in a schematic way, how this potentially can be done with different sectors involved. So I think this is a very important goal and an area in which microbiologists and their collaborations with engineers and economists can be very productive. So that gives some summaries of the various aspects. So summarizing microbial processes for greenhouse gases. So first point is, much is known about the microbes, their biochemistry, the environmental conditions for the production and consumption of the three greenhouse gases. So we know a lot. Is there anything else left to learn? Well, I would say yes, there is. But at a more systems level, it's often the environment that is most important for controlling the rates and the directions, meaning production or consumption. And that is an area for improved knowledge and potentially for altered management. And I'll just give a few major examples here. In soil management, wastewater treatment, solid waste disposal, fisheries and coastal management, forest management, and others, in which the environmental conditions at that local scale is actually what's determining what the microbes are doing and how fast they're doing it. If we better understand that, we can minimize their production, encourage their consumption in some cases, and have information that for modeling that helps scale up the microbial contribution to larger systems. So a quick summary of these different components. There's, of course, CO2 production. And for those of you who are microbiologists, this is the thing you know very well. But for CO2 production, heterotrophic bacteria, fungi, protozoa, they all make their living oxidizing organic carbon, producing CO2. The most important part here I put in red, and especially at the bottom. This is usually controlled by the accessibility to the organic carbon as well as the environmental condition. If it's not healthy for life, then the microbes can't grow there. But if it's healthy for life and they have accessibility to the organic carbon, they're going to oxidize it to CO2. So it's that last point that is important in CO2 production. And how about the CO2 consumption side? Well, that's autotrophs, fixation of CO2, especially by phototrophs. And in the aquatic system, that's algae. And in the ocean, river, and lake environments, they are major consumers of CO2. On the terrestrial environment, it's the plants that are the phototrophs that consume the CO2. But bacteria can help make a healthy soil environment for more effective plant fixation. And the last point I put in red is because CO2 consumption requires reductant and energy. So it's managing those conditions that can favor the fixation of CO2. Then on the methane side, and I want to point out that so far in the discussion group at ASM, of the three gases, we consider the methane case the lowest hanging fruit. In other words, in which microbial knowledge could be the most effective in reducing climate change. And as I alluded to before, nitrous oxide is probably a second on that list. So these are issues important with regard to microbes, but I would point out two things. One is the thermodynamics limits control the system because methanogenesis is a very energy-consuming process, and that only goes on in certain environments in which those thermodynamic conditions are met. It's also an anaerobic process. And so any competing electron acceptor, especially oxygen, nitrate, sulfate, will stop methanogenesis. On the other side, methane oxidation or methanotrophy, there are methane oxidizers in many, many places ready to oxidize that methane to CO2. And it's the particulate methane monooxygenase that's most important environmentally. And one of the big issues here with methane oxidation, I put it in red, is high affinity or low Km microbes that can consume methane at atmospheric concentrations. This is very important, little known until the last several years. It was not really understood what methanotrophs could do this. You could see the methane consumption at these very low concentrations by some soil systems, for example, but you didn't understand how it could happen by what organisms and biochemically. Now there's more information known about that, but that is really important from the point of view of pulling down the methane concentration in the atmosphere. If we go to nitrous oxide production, it's denitrifiers and nitrifiers produce nitrous oxide. And it's certain environmental conditions that cause that production. If the environment is anaerobic, then nitrous oxide will be reduced all the way to nitrogen. But under certain conditions, like less reductant, more acidity, then nitrous oxide can be produced by these organisms. And on the side of nitrous oxide consumption, denitrifiers are the consumers. And if there's an excess electron donor, no other electron acceptors, then they'll reduce nitrous oxide to nitrogen gas and no issue. But nitrous oxide is very soluble in water, so most groundwaters will have some nitrous oxide in it, unless the conditions are such that microbes need that nitrous oxide as their electron acceptor. So that's sort of a summary of those three gases and what microbes do in producing and consuming them. And what I'm suggesting is that there are research opportunities to more definitively understand some of those processes and what controls them under particular environmental conditions, and to be able to quantify that so that it can be useful in models. Now I'm going to finish with just a few examples of research that I've worked on that illustrate some factors that are important. This was a study done in eastern Ghana, the Savannah region, which has a reasonable amount of water. And the goal was practical as well. A winter food crop, more carbon stored in the soil for improved soil texture, cash for the European carbon market, and increased soil fertility. So what could be done? So in the upper left-hand corner here, it's what was normally tried in the winter season to grow corn, their most popular crop in the winter as well as summer. But you see this crop is very inefficient. On the right-hand side, this farmer has planted a legume, mucuna, which is a nitrogen fixer and can grow well during that summer season and produce a food as well. And in the lower left-hand corner at the bottom is that same environment just above it in which no production was allowed for 4 years. And after 4 years, it could no longer grow a corn crop. And on the right-hand side, this is called bare fallow after 4 years, you can see the amount of carbon left in the soil and the amount of microbial biomass. Compared to the unmanaged situation, it's lost half of its soil carbon. That's been oxidized to CO2, an important contributor to carbon. But if they grow other crops like pigeon pea, which is a nitrogen fixer, or fertilized maize, you can see it produces more than naturally. So it can then earn money on the carbon market, and the microbial populations are higher. So it shows how soil management can influence carbon fate as well as provide more food for humans. Another example, a project I worked on was in the Amazon rainforest. This is in Rondônia state in southwestern Brazil. And here you can see the forest fires occurring as the forest is cleared for more cropland. So this shows then what's happening over time. You can see many, many fires there as the forest is being cleared. And here you can see what that area was in 1975 in this right-hand picture. In 1989, you can see the roads built and then housing coming in. And then you can see in 2013, then a highly populated area. So rainforest disappearing, people moving in, and CO2 consumption from the plants disappearing. But what else happens? How about methane oxidizers, important to this methane cycle? So this is the abundance of methane oxidizers during that conversion. So on the very left-hand side was forest that was not converted. And as it was converted to pasture, the methane consumption went down. But in this experimental area, some was allowed to revert to secondary forest. And you can see that the methane oxidation increased. So it shows how land use alters the structure of methane oxidizing bacteria, which is important to this methane component of the global cycle. Another example, this is permafrost carbon storage, which you probably know is huge in the Northern Hemisphere. And then if we look at this from a quantitative point of view, so this is the permafrost carbon in peatlands, in mineral soil, in Siberian deep carbon, and alluvial deep carbon, totaling up to this amount here, which is equal to the total soil carbon at 1 meter. And that is half of the atmospheric carbon, and less, or the atmospheric carbon is half of that amount, and that in vegetation is even a little smaller than that amount. So the big point here is that the global carbon soil pools are high, and especially in this North Polar region. And that is where climate is warming the most. And this was a study that we were involved in which we evaluated minimal thaw, moderate thaw, and extensive thaw in the Arctic region. And this is old carbon, not new carbon, but old soil carbon. And so you can see at the different time periods here, the amount of carbon released. And so the extensive thaw releases the most carbon. The minimal thaw begins to release old carbon. And as the thaw becomes greater, then more and more carbon is released. So it's not only recent carbon that is turning over when it melts, it's old carbon stimulated by microbial processes that when microbes are active, then they also begin to eat the old, more well-preserved carbon, further enhancing the CO2 production. Another problem in the Arctic region is thermokarst, which is when the soil melts, a lot of it collapses, as shown here. And when it collapses, then there are wet areas. And these wet areas then can be methane producers because water will saturate everything, plenty of organic carbon there, so the oxygen will disappear. So it's anaerobic conditions for methane production. So not only CO2, but methane production increases in the Arctic as it thaws. Another study I was involved in Greenland with a Danish group that had a 10-year study about climate conditions in Greenland and what might be changing. And this was to evaluate whether methane oxidizers were active in Greenland. And on the western part of Greenland, there are soils, or very barren soils, but soils. There are microbes, and there are methane oxidizers. And we learned that in the northern part of Greenland, they're very different than in the southern part. And this relates to the water balance in Greenland. And we also know that the types of methane producers in the north and the south are very different, as illustrated here, from the PMO, the methane oxidase gene, and its assembly, and then quantifying that gene. And importantly, we did learn that these microbes can consume atmospheric concentrations of methane. And there are some, from molecular studies, we can determine there are some types that are consistent with ones now known to be consumers of methane at these very low atmospheric concentrations. So a point in which one can show that by understanding the microbial processes in more detail, then we can learn what is important. So summary, these are the research recommendations from that AMM report. So emphasize interdisciplinary research aims on understanding how microbial activities, microbial fluxes alter as climate, precipitation, and temperature changes globally. So emphasizing the interdisciplinary aspect of that because this is a coupled system. Second, provide guidance on experimental design and data collection that allows for data comparison across diverse and global ecosystems. Yes, so we can take this information from various locations and similar enough in its design and data collection that it can be integrated to scale up for a larger understanding. The third, incorporating existing data on microbial diversity and activity on producing and consuming greenhouse gases into Earth climate models. A lot of information exists. Can we incorporate that into in the models now? And the fourth is outline specific criteria to evaluate new innovations to assess the scientific and societal impacts of these innovations. So we know what they do both scientifically as well as their cascading societal effects. Then ASM was very interested in not only the science part of this, but how this moves to the next level. so policy and regulation and societal issues. So their recommendations there are increased research investments to generate knowledge and awareness of the contributions of microbes to greenhouse gases, and use these in evidence-based science policy and regulatory strategies. Not only get the information, but with the view that it'll be actually used. Deploy increased surveillance and detections of zoonotic and vector-borne diseases, and incorporate the One Health approach. Exact policies that facilitate public-private partnerships between diverse scientists, entrepreneurs, commercial entities, regulatory bodies to translate research into scalable microbial inventions. Yes, not stop at the research, but develop an environment at the public, private, regulatory level that facilitates implementation of discoveries. And develop policies that incentivize innovation of the microbial facilitated processes to support renewable energy generation and a robust bioeconomy. And finally, there's also societal recommendations. Engage and clearly communicate with the general public in jargon-free and relatable ways to improve comprehension of how microbes participate in climate change. And highlight and prioritize assessing inequities to microbial threats to vulnerable communities of greater risk of infectious disease exposure, altered microbiota, and food insecurity caused by climate change. So, in summary, the report tries to not only deal with the science side, but also going beyond the research output to how that's implemented and its impact with society. So I would just summarize from my perspective of the most impactful points for microbes and climate. Store more soil carbon. No-till agriculture, cover crops is the way that is being implemented now in some locations. Can have a huge impact. Maintain biomass carbon and nitrogen. So maintain and restore forests or other naturally vegetated systems and use existing carbon and nitrogen. It's already fixed. Keep it and reuse it. And decrease polar warming, which only human behavior can slow that rate. That's probably the biggest challenge area in terms of microbial processes. Whoops. So then, and concluding, I go back to my first slide, which is, it's the microbiologist's challenge to understand and manage these microbial processes where possible to minimize climate change. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. TG, for that very enlightening talk. Indeed, we learned a lot from your talk. Now, moving on to our next speaker to give us a discussion on network models for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Let us all listen to Dr. Kathleen Aviso. Dr. Aviso.
Thank you very much, Academician Rivera. So let me just share my screen. Oops, sorry. Hold on. So good morning, everyone. I'm here in behalf of Academician Raymond Tan, but I'm here to share our work, and it's entitled Network Models for Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation. It is a joint collaboration between colleagues from De La Salle University and University of Miskolc in Hungary. So this is the team. So Professor Heriberto Cabezas is based in the University of Miskolc in Hungary, while Dr. Angeline Lau, myself, and Academician Tan all belong to De La Salle. So let me begin by saying this, that climate change will increasingly put pressure on food production. This particular presentation will focus on two sustainable development goals, particularly zero hunger and climate action, how they are interlinked with each other, how network models can actually help, and how microbes can play a role in these network models. This is a brief outline of my presentation. We'll talk about vicious cycles and networks, process graph models for socio-ecological networks, engineered co-culture systems, and finally, I'll end with some concluding remarks. The interconnectedness of ecological systems will require a holistic approach when crafting strategies. Even the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are linked with each other. This presentation, like I mentioned, will focus on two of these Sustainable Development Goals. And I think it nicely links up to the previous presentations given today. SDG 2, or Zero Hunger, is meant to address hunger, food security, and nutrition globally. This issue is exacerbated by conflict, such as the war in Ukraine, pandemics like the COVID-19, and the growing inequalities among nations. Sustainable agriculture can be one of the strategies to address the Sustainable Development Goal. And I believe that everyone can relate very much to this SDG. However, one of the challenges is providing enough food for the growing global population, as it is estimated that the global population will reach 10 billion by the end of the century. Feeding the world will be affected not just by consumer behavior, but also by climate change. It will be limited by available resources such as land, water, and nutrients. This puts a pressure on planetary boundaries needed to ensure that we maintain sustainability in this Earth. An article published in 2010 already outlined the challenges of feeding the global population, while a more recent article in 2020 has created a model that integrates planetary boundaries and various sustainability strategies to address food security. And based on the research, it is possible to feed 10 billion people within terrestrial planetary boundaries if we adopt more sustainable strategies. The next SDG is on climate action. Climate change is arguably the most important environmental issue that we are facing today. Because it ties up with other sustainability issues like food security, more severe weather patterns, and water scarcity, it really is something that we need to address. With climate change primarily driven by the concentration of greenhouse gas emissions, such as carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, our goal is to reduce global carbon emissions to net zero by the year 2050, to keep atmospheric temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius, or if possible, below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Anything higher will result in extremely devastating effects. Strategies focus on either climate mitigation or climate adaptation. And we are already experiencing the effects of climate change. Warmer ocean temperatures, for example, have stressed marine ecosystems, thereby affecting algae, corals, and all other species that are linked to them. This is why I wanted to emphasize the interconnectedness of ecosystem networks and how disruptions in one particular species or an impact in one species really affects all other species linked to them. So like I said, this links SDG 2, which is for zero hunger, with SDG 13 on climate action. Factors which will affect food production to address zero hunger is affected by planetary boundaries, climate change, and network effects. Highly interdependent ecosystems will experience cascade effects that are difficult to predict. And so when we develop models to describe ecosystems, it's very important to have a more holistic approach so that we can adequately account for the interactions between the species involved in the system, and so that we know exactly how a particular system can potentially behave. As an example, there might be counterintuitive network effects. This particular example shows us that a decrease in the population of baleen whales expected an increase in the population of plankton because baleen whales actually feed on the plankton. However, when this actually happened, the reverse occurred. The decrease in baleen population also resulted in the decrease in plankton population. This is an example of unexpected network effects, which emphasize the need of using a systems approach for integrated systems. Now let's move on process graph models for socio-ecological networks. What I'll be presenting today is really a proposal on a different approach or a different methodology of modeling socio-ecological networks. It was initially developed by Lau and colleagues in 2020, wherein they proposed the integration of process graphs or P graphs to model socio-ecological networks. But what exactly are process graphs? So process graphs actually emerged from the field of chemical engineering under the subfield of computer-aided process engineering. Process graphs were initially utilized to develop or design industrial plants so that you can identify the correct process units to include in your process plant to provide a more efficient production of products and services. It is a graph theoretic approach for process network synthesis, initially developed by Ferenc Friedler as well as L.T. Fan. Some of its advantages include computational efficiency and its ability to automatically generate alternative network structures. So what Lau and colleagues did was to take this approach to try and model socio-ecological networks. One of the limitations of other ecological network models was that they were unable to represent in graphs the different types of interactions that happen between species in an ecosystem. However, by using the P-graph approach, they were able to represent different types of interactions between the species in an ecosystem. So by using process graphs, it was able to assemble fragmented information into a coherent picture. This is something that we need, especially since experts in various fields would probably have a better understanding of their domain, but there are some overlaps with other fields. And what we really need is to have that integrated or coherent picture wherein we can draw upon the expertise from the different fields and try to assemble all these things into a more integrated network. Process graphs can enumerate viable ecosystems, model multiple types of network linkages. It can also model dietary flexibility of species in your ecosystem and can identify limiting states. So this is how an ecosystem is built within P-graphs. So within an ecosystem, the key is in identifying the different types of species involved in the ecosystem and the different kinds of interactions that occur or happen within the ecosystem. In this particular example, you can see on the lower right-hand corner that this particular unit represents a herbivore in the system. The nodes on top represents the requirements or the necessities needed for a particular herbivore to thrive. In this case, it was habitat and food for nutrition. While the nodes at the bottom represent the different services or products that a herbivore can provide within the ecosystem. In this case, it includes food for carnivores, possibility food for humans, and it also results in detritus when the herbivore eventually dies off. So such kinds of building blocks can be built for all other components or all other species within the network, so that you come up with a superstructure model which would resemble something like this. So it shows us all the possible connections or interactions between the different species within your network. Process graphs actually have three different algorithms. One would be maximal structure generator, which provides with the superstructure of the entire system that you are looking at. It can generate multiple feasible networks through the SSG algorithm, and then it can identify the optimal network using the ABB algorithm. By conducting these different algorithms or by implementing these different algorithms, it is possible to identify the criticality of species within ecosystems and their viability on whether such ecosystems will really exist. So using the same approach, we've actually extended this work to look at engineering co-culture systems. This work was recently published in Nature Sustainability. What we did is to look at a co-culture system as a potential approach towards increasing or intensifying food productivity in the midst of climate change. So a typical rice paddy would look like this, as everyone would be aware of. We know that there would be water also in the rice paddy. There has been work in China, particularly by the group of Dong et al. And I've seen other publications as well describing this type of co-culture system. What they did is to try and intensify food production within rice co-culture systems by allowing other types of species such as invertebrates to actually live in the rice paddy itself. So what happens is that you minimize the amount of resources that you will actually need, such as land footprint. And you can actually grow multiple types of products or multiple types of food products. One would be rice as a primary product, and the second one would be the invertebrates such as shrimp or crayfish. So in this work, this is how the rice crayfish model would look like. This was adapted from the work of Dong et al., where they have identified the different types of species that actually play a role in making sure that the co-culture system would be productive or would be successful. Now, in most network models, what they do is to actually observe these interactions in the field. And so they describe, they are empirical descriptions of what is actually happening. So in addition to the species that we have identified, there is a smaller figure down here, which shows us that all other species, when they die, would all contribute to detritus, which is also part of the entire ecosystem. So what we did is to generate the maximal structure, which illustrates the different interaction between the different species in the model. We have identified rice as the primary crop, wherein the rice yield is used as a proxy for land area. Our intention is to try and engineer more sustainable or more optimized food systems. So it's more like engineering the food system rather than just looking at the empirical data. It's identifying possible structures of the ecosystem that will yield to more efficient productivity. Our secondary product is the crayfish, which we have indicated here at the bottom. So upon optimizing the structure, we have actually identified 60 different networks. So one other advantage of the pGraph platform is that it identifies not just the optimal approach or optimal network, but it can also identify near optimal designs. which might be useful for any decision maker, especially if the performance of the near optimal structure is not so far from the optimal network. So in our solution, this was the most productive network. But you can clearly see here that the number of species involved in the network is relatively sparse compared to the original or the baseline network. And of course, anyone would probably argue that for such systems, these might not be robust and might collapse right away once one of the species is lost or is removed from the system. And in this particular solution, it yields a total of 1.2 kilograms of crayfish for every kilogram of rice harvested in the system. The next structure contains a bit more number of individuals or species. In this case, we have 8 in contrast to 5 of the initial optimal network. The addition of species slightly reduces the productivity of the system, but it is only 0.4% worse than the optimum. But you can see that there are more species available and can potentially be a more robust network. This would be solution 3, which yields about the same productivity as solution 2, but has more species. So we've generated a total of 60 networks, and we have summarized how these networks perform in terms of their productivity, of the amount of crayfish being generated per kilogram of rice against the availability of the number of species in the network. And what we found is that there are families of structures which can actually have similar yields or similar performance even when there were different species involved in the network. And another insight that we have found is that there are step changes. And so these are regions that need to be avoided. For example, if you were trying to design your co-culture system, you have to watch out for such instances to ensure that you do not have a great loss in yield or productivity. So some insights for sustainable farming. So these solutions provide normative benchmarks for farming practices. I know that the results of the model cannot be implemented perfectly in real life, but they serve as benchmarks on how much a particular system can potentially achieve. And so a farmer, for example, or somebody who's conducting co-culture systems can actually benchmark on how far their level of productivity is with what is possible, what can actually be achieved. So near optimal solutions can be identified with more robust characteristics, and model results can also be used to plan agronomic field studies. So other prospective areas of application would include ecologically engineered food and non-food plantations. We've actually collaborated with 2 colleagues from the biology department to look at the possibility of invasive species management using the same approach, or looking at biological pest controls. So these are things that will also become relevant due to the impacts of climate change, because we can expect more invasive species coming in, and we might not have the available control for these species. So in conclusion, what we've done is to develop a process graph modeling technique for ecological networks, which is another approach at looking at ecological networks. So these models can be used to engineer sustainable food production systems instead of just, describing or looking at empirical results. Simulations can also be used so that we can plan agronomic studies. So I just wanted to thank all our collaborators. And with that, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. And I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you very much for that very insightful presentation, Dr. Abiso. Now, let me introduce our discussants for today. Okay, let's begin with Dr. Francis L. de los Reyes. Dr. de los Reyes is a corresponding member of the National Academy of Science and Technology Philippines. Currently, he is a Glenn E. and Phyllis Fottrell Distinguished Professor of Civil, Construction, and Environmental Engineering, Alumni Distinguished Undergraduate Professor, and University Faculty Scholar at North Carolina State University in the USA. He is also an Associate Faculty of Microbiology and a Training Faculty of Biotechnology. He teaches undergraduate and graduate classes on wastewater treatment plant design, environmental biotechnology and microbiology, fundamentals of environmental engineering, and water and sanitation for developing countries. He has conducted workshops for wastewater treatment plant operators and professionals in the US, also in the Philippines. He has also worked on water and sanitation issues in developing countries and has collaboration in the Philippines, India, China, South Africa, Pakistan, Ghana, and Malawi. He is a board-certified environmental engineer by eminence of the American Academy of Environmental Engineers, also a WEF Fellow or Water Environment Federation Fellow. He is a TED Fellow, and his TED Talk on sanitation has been viewed over 800,000 times. Our second discussant is Dr. Deo Florence L. Onda. Dr. Onda is an Associate Professor and Deputy Director for Research at the UP Marine Science Institute. His research interest includes understanding host-symbiont interactions, microbial biogeography, diversity, dynamics, and trophic interactions, and consequences of changing conditions using omics approaches like genomics, transcriptomics, and also metagenomics. And also advanced techniques in confocal laser scanning microscopy. He received his inter-university PhD in oceanography, major in microbial oceanography at University Laval, Quebec in Canada, and postdoctoral fellowship at the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany. Okay, so we would like to welcome now Dr. de los Reyes.
Yes, good morning. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, so I think my role as discussant is really to highlight some of the major things, major aspects in the three talks that we heard today from Dr. TJ, from Dr. Kea Viso, and academician Pauline. And really, this graph is something that I got from this paper, which also you saw in Jim TG's slides. And it's really a systems view of microbial processes. And of course, this is showing the production of CO2, of methane. And what's missing here is really the nitrogen cycle that shows nitrous oxides, for example. But I wanted to highlight this graph because what this is really a different way of thinking about microbial processes. Most microbiologists, and maybe most of the audience are microbiologists, we think about our little experiments, we think about our particular microorganism or a particular function in the lab or in the field. But what climate change is forcing us to think about is on a bigger scale, on a global scale. And so when we think of these pictures like this, they summarize all of those processes and reminds us that we should look at it from a systems point of view. And these systems are varying in space across the whole globe, as well as varying in time. A little bit different way of thinking about microbial processes and their impacts. So you've heard examples of this from Dr. TG's talk, where microorganisms affect climate change. And I put up some examples here. For example, marine phytoplankton performing half of global CO2 fixation, and also half of oxygen production, even though it's a very small percentage of global biomass. Something that we don't really know a lot about are seafloor methanogens and methanotrophs, producers and consumers of methane. We heard about how soil microorganisms regulate organic carbon and release CO2 back into the atmosphere. And then the example of this permafrost, negative feedback cycle, where basically with increasing temperatures, you have more exposures of what used to be permafrost, and microbial decomposition, essentially releasing methane and CO2. So microorganisms affect climate change, but climate change also affects microorganisms. So essentially, microorganisms, their activities, their functions are affected by changes in temperature and the weather changes associated with climate change. So ocean warming, acidification, eutrophication, overuse are examples of processes and phenomena that affect microorganisms. We know that shifts in climate can influence the structure and diversity of microbial communities directly and indirectly. And also, for example, that climate change favors certain cyanobacterial blooms, and again, both directly and indirectly. So again, the thing that I wanted to point out here is how climate change is affected by microorganisms, and climate change affects microorganisms. So you have this ongoing cycle that we need to understand. Here's another figure that just shows man-made activities and the impacts of microorganisms. Many of these have been discussed already by Dr. TG. But in the Philippine context, we also have to think about a lot of these factors. For example, runoff of fertilizers affecting microbial processes in rivers and lakes. This is something that is a big issue in the Philippines. Discharge of wastewater that contain high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus. As far as I know, in the Philippines, we don't have phosphorus limits, for example, for our wastewater discharge, and we don't really have nitrogen limits. We only have BOD limits. So eutrophication is something that, is a big issue that we don't even have, wastewater standards for. Emissions from agricultural and industry, as well as from wastewater treatment. And in the Philippines, about 20% of the population is sewered. And so these big wastewater treatment plants only apply to about 20% of the population. The rest, 80%, are served by septic tanks and various forms of pit latrines. And the contribution of those to methane, for example, are not really quantified. Ruminants are a big portion of methane production. About 27% of all methane production actually comes from cows and sheep and goats. I was just at a master's defense today, actually, and the topic was about feed additives that you can add to ruminant feed that will basically stop methanogenesis, and so increase the production of acids within the rumen of cows. And this is a big issue that we probably know, but there are even approaches we can take to limit methanogenesis. And then rice paddies. On the bottom right here, in the Philippines, rice is a staple crop, and we have a lot of lowland rice that's pretty much submerged in water, and actually methanogens produce high levels of methane in these rice paddies. Another big issue that we have are vector-borne pathogens. For example, in the Philippines, we have increasing and seasonal increases in diseases like dengue because of the Aedes mosquitoes that carry, for example, that are vectors for the pathogens that cause these diseases. In other countries where you have seasonal, monsoon rains, you can almost predict the spread of cholera. For example, it coincides with the flooding, and that's again due to changing weather patterns. A big issue in the Philippines is climate change stressing marine life. We rely on our seas and diseases in our sea creatures would adversely affect our economy. And then here in the bottom is something that is a concern in a lot of countries, which is the increase of antimicrobial resistance of microorganisms. And again, understanding how climate change affects the transport and transmission of these resistance to many different microorganisms is a big issue. I wanted to ask a few questions of our speakers, but also try to identify research needs if we're looking at climate change and microorganisms. So the first need I see is that we need a long-term microbial ecological research observatory or observatories, many of them in the country. What we have now are short-term research projects. These long-term research observatories would allow us to study systems, year in and year out over a longer period, and also with the right instrumentation and the right data and the right sampling regimens, so we can answer questions that are specific to our situation in the Philippines. So, for example, methane. What do we know about different conditions in rice paddies that contribute to different amounts of methane being released to the atmosphere? What about our swamps and what about our mangroves? I talked about our septic systems. We have a lot of esteros or open canals. We don't really know how much of the methane is coming from that. Deforestation is a big issue. I think Jim talked about the impacts of deforestation. We know this is happening in the Sierra Madre and other mountain ranges in the Philippines. What's the impact of that on organic carbon and CO2? And these are things that we need to quantify. So maybe this is something for NAST and something for the Biological Sciences Division to think about long-term ecological research observatories. So the goal of those observatories is to get Philippine-based data and putting this in databases that can be accessed by different researchers, looking at microbial communities and especially function, and then quantifying ecological effects, looking at food, looking at water systems. And then the goal of that Philippine-based data is to generate Philippine-based models. The talk by Dr. Aviso talked about P-graphs and networks. And these are using data from published papers, but what if we actually have data from the Philippines and actual models that are based on our situation in the Philippines? And then another research need is success stories in research and national projects. I think any discussion of climate change is, can be pessimistic in tone, right? Because there's a lot of issues, a lot of problems. They seem to be big in scale and hard to think about, and also hard to grasp and maybe even see the solutions. So we need to highlight success stories in the research and actual projects. For example, that Ghana example that Dr. TG highlighted, we should have many of those, and we should have many of those also in the Philippines. One of the terms that I caught in Dr. TG's talk is microbial injustice. And of course, we know about the microbial effects on climate change. We know how climate change affects different sectors differently. And we know that marginalized populations and sectors that are poorer or economically more distressed suffer more from climate change effects. But putting them all together and calling it microbial injustice was something that I learned today. And so how do we quantify the extent of microbial injustice in the Philippines? And this is going to change depending on the system that we're talking about, right? Are we talking about a food system, a water system, an energy system? How do we set quantifiable goals in terms of moving away from microbial injustice towards microbial justice? And how do we address the challenges? In other words, where are we in microbial injustice in the Philippines? Where do we want to go? And then how do we get there? I think these are research needs and maybe more like research questions and concepts that we need to talk about. And then finally, I did have questions. Maybe the first three are for Dr. TG. how can we scale up success stories and cases? Again, there's a dire outlook with respect to climate change. How many more Ghana stories are there, and how do we think about showing the general public and policymakers that we need to move in that direction? And the second is related. How can we best advocate for this circular economy framework? And this has to do with one of the questions in the chat, right? Basically, making sure that there's profit to be made or somebody's gaining an economic advantage. And so how do we show that to policymakers? The third one I've touched on a little bit. Are there specific cases or projects where microbial injustice has been addressed? Right? I feel like that is an interesting question, but also a very important question. And then for Dr. Aviso, is it possible to add microbial processes to those networks? For example, instead of maximizing food, we're minimizing methane production, right? And still maybe having a certain yield of food production. So I'll stop there, and maybe, I'm sure there are going to be more questions, but I wanted to point out some of, or basically air out some of these questions for us to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. De Los Reyes, also for enumerating those potential research needs on this topic. Okay, we can now move on to our second discussant, Dr. Deo Florence Onda.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Rivera, and I apologize if I am not able to turn on my camera just to make sure that I won't get disconnected during the presentation. I'm actually joining you from a very remote place in Benguet right now, but I'm still very happy to be here. I think we've learned a lot from the presentations of the previous speakers as well as the discussant. And I think my role here now is to provide probably to add to the discussions and to provide the perspective on the Philippines, especially on the marine environment, given that the marine ecosystem is also the biggest ecosystem we have in the country. And the roles played by the oceans, both by the oceans and the microorganisms in climate change. One of the main effects probably
We lost Dr. Onda. Okay, let's wait for a few minutes. So while waiting for Dr. Onda, you may want to type in your questions in our Q&A box. For those participants in the Facebook Live, you may also type in your comments.
Yeah, I apologize for that. I really apologize. I'm just saying. Yeah. So one of the effects of climate change, especially in the Philippines, is really sea surface warming. And some of its consequences are the migration of the different species displacement, as well as biodiversity loss. And the question remains for the Philippines is that what are the implications of this to the microorganisms? Especially that the seas are getting warmer in the country. Ocean acidification is also becoming apparent. What are the implications of this to the different ecosystem functions that we rely on and the benefits that we get from the marine environment, especially in the context of the Philippines? This is still an ongoing question that we need to answer as Filipinos. So what we did so far is to try to go back to literature, being the scientific papers as a possible indicators of how much we have progressed in this topic in the past years. And this is why it is important to look at the Philippines is because the different parts of the Philippines respond differently to climate change. Different parts of the ocean or the different regions of the country will experience more of the ocean acidification effect. Others would be more on the extreme heating event or increased ocean temperature, extreme rainfall events, and all of this will affect actually the regimes where microorganisms live. And therefore, one approach does not really apply to all in the case of the Philippines. If we want to understand how the Philippines is responding, we also need to understand the different biogeographic regions as well as the localities, the context in these localities. But understanding the effects of climate change would also entail understanding each and every aspect and each and every component of the ecosystems we have, including those that are actually at the base of the food web, and those are the microorganisms. This is really important, especially if we talk about food security. The Philippines being a 82% water, where 50% or more than 50% of our population actually live on the coast. So it is really apparent and it is needed that we need to understand the roles of microorganisms in our own waters. But what have we done so far? So there's this review paper that we've published and reviewed all the possible retrievable publications in the past 27 years. This was written in 2019. So in those 27 years, many of the publications on microorganisms, as well as marine microorganisms specifically, have focused on aquaculture studies, and that is very much understandable. The Philippines being an aquaculture and marine-based country, a lot of studies have also focused on biotechnology. The diversity, the enormous diversity we have, also provide bioresources, untapped resources for biotechnological applications and industrial applications. But interestingly, there's not much studies that have been done on understanding climate change from the scope of the microorganisms. If you're going to look at the pie graph on the left, many of these have focused on viruses, bacteria, microalgae, non-photosynthetic protists, and fungi. But again, very much related to aquaculture biotechnology. Most of the microalgal studies were on HABs. And again, this is understandable because more than 80 embayments of the Philippines have been contaminated by harmful algal blooms or red tide. But for the bacteria, many were also very much into aquaculture, or those that are associated with harmful algal blooms, or those that are associated with aquaculture species such as shrimps or the other invertebrates and water sediments for their potential use as sources of drugs. So there's, again, emphasizing that there are a lot of aspects that we have not really explored on in terms of climate change and the role of microorganisms. But we have been seeing some increase in these publications throughout the years from 1990s to 2010, 2017. We have seen increasing number of published works across the fields. There are also the use of new and emerging techniques, but clearly there's really a lot that needs to be done to understand climate change and the role of microbes of climate change in the Philippines. But I would like to see this not just as limitation and probably adding to the discussion. And thank you again to the organizers for emphasizing this, that although these are limitations, these are actually opportunities for Filipino scientists. The Philippines being tagged as the center of marine biodiversity, being part of the Coral Triangle, being a biodiversity hotspot and also a fisheries hotspot of the world. Understanding this from the scope of the microorganisms is really a challenge for the Filipinos. But more than a challenge, it is an opportunity for us to contribute to these discussions. We also looked into what investments the government has done in R&D and research and development related to climate change and microorganisms. So this is collated data from the Philippine Council for Agriculture, Aquatic and Natural Research and Development, or PICARD, of the Department of Science and Technology, where we categorized the number of projects, the number of research programs that they have funded from 2000 to 2017. And we separated them or categorized them by the theme. And from here, you will see that climate change, harmful algal blooms, and other microbiology are really not the most funded, especially those that are related to climate change, represented here by the green box. Many of the microbiological work have focused on harmful algal blooms, but those that are related to climate change, such as ocean acidification and responses to the changing conditions, for example, have been very, very limited. But the next question is that if funding is actually available, why is it that there's limited number of works that has been done on microbes and climate change, especially in the context of the marine environment in the Philippines? We need to understand that we need experts. We need people, warm bodies to actually work on this. We need infrastructure. In the case of ocean sciences, which is, again, 82% of the territory of the Philippines, we need capacity to actually go to these places, collect the samples, and then bring those samples back into the lab to understand the issues that we are trying to resolve. We also need infrastructures, offshore and onshore infrastructures. And again, we need funding. Many of the sentiments from the scientists is that research on climate change is considered to be very basic. And there is a general sentiment that probably funding for basic research has been very limited. And that actually reflects also on the funding, for example, of the National Research Council of the Philippines, which is the agency that really funds the basic studies being proposed by scientists. But what have we, another possible limitation is also the very slow adoption of technologies that can help us understand microorganisms across the board, meaning even studies in the terrestrial, coastal to the open oceans. If you're going to look back into the papers that have been published since the 1980s and see what types of methods they have utilized to understand or actually do studies on microorganisms, the 1980s have been very much dominated by microscopy and culturing. 2000s were dominated already by the adoption of PCR, cloning, and sequencing. 2010 was the first introduction of the next generation sequencing, and then the establishment of the Philippine Genome Center. The establishment of the Philippine Genome Center in 2011 somewhat actually facilitated the transition to a more high throughput approaches. That's why there was also the establishment of the sequencing core facility in 2013, and then the publication of the first high throughput sequencing paper on ocean bacteria in 2018, and another publication on marine phytoplankton also in 2020. But overall, so this actually facilitated the entry of the Philippine scientific community into the omics era, specifically for this on the marine microorganisms. So adoption of new and state-of-the-art technologies in environmental research in the Philippines somewhat had been very slow. These also affected the types of works, the scope of works being done by the scientists, I think because of the limitations in the methodologies. From the 1850s to 2021, many of the work done in the early parts of the century were done by foreign scientists. Filipino scientists, the studies of Filipino scientists started appearing in the 1960s. And then hub studies, when it became very apparent, started in the 1980s. And then Dr. Azanzo is also the president of the National Academy of Science and Technology, ushered the country into understanding or doing more work on harmful algal blooms, and also the introduction of other methodologies such as remote sense study, and then more experimental and in situ work on HABs and diversity of phytoplankton, until it ushered into the omics era. But if you're going to look at the thematics, many of the work that is being done until now is really focused on diversity, on HABs, modeling, molecular, and remote sensing. But there's really a few that tries to correlate these patterns with climate change. So the limited and slow adoption of technologies to study microbes also resulted in the limited understanding on the roles of microbes on climate change in the Philippines. We also wanted to understand how much of the waters have we studied so far. This is a plot of all the published articles from the 1980s to 2017, showing you where the studies have been done. Studies meaning they collected samples from that area, for many different possible thematics of research or experimental in situ experimental activities are being done. So there's really not much a lot, and there's still a lot of areas in the Philippines which are also important fishing grounds that have not yet been studied. For example, Aurora in Isabela is in the northeast Philippines is actually an important fishing ground. And yet we have not really understood the diversity, the dynamics, and even the possible responses of the microorganisms on climate change. Palawan also, which is an important fishing ground in the biodiversity hotspot, including the Sulu Sea, have not yet been fully studied. So there's a lot of areas in the country that provide economic benefits being rich fishing grounds that have not yet been investigated. So it also again emphasizes what do we have so far in terms of understanding food security when we have not really fully understood the very ecosystems that actually provide those security. So another limitation, and I would like to echo the comment of Dr. Francis earlier, the Philippines does not have a long-term monitoring station for microorganisms. We have some for terrestrial environments and for forestry, but we do not have for microorganisms. And this limits the understanding of the incremental changes that is actually happening in the environment, especially in the context of climate change. There are already advanced technologies available out there, but have not yet been adopted. One of the things that my institute and my project, for example, is doing, adopting high throughput in advanced technologies such as this imaging flow cytobot, which are unmanned and automated and can collect data real time and can be coupled with machine learning in order to increase our capacity for monitoring, that we have started implementing this year with support from the Commission on Higher Education. And the idea here is to come up with different monitoring stations in the Philippines so that we have a long-term biological monitoring stations that can be used for different purposes, such as hubs for biodiversity, for climate change and other issues. But we need more. We need more institutions that need to be trained. We need more institutions that would have the expertise to implement these technologies in order for us to really understand the country as an archipelago. And that, again, is a challenge for the Philippines. We are an archipelago. So just to recall what some of the discussions that have already been presented by the previous speakers, microbes are affecting global processes and thus also affected by climate change. And when we breathe, as the previous speakers mentioned earlier, we need to think about microbes. When we eat fish, we need to think about microbes because they are serving as the base of the food web. And when we think about the earth and climate, we need to think about the microbes because they are driving this biogeochemical processes. So sometimes those with the smallest size actually also play the biggest roles. Hopefully I was able to provide some context of discussions for the Philippines. And again, I would like to thank the organizers and I apologize for the glitch earlier. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Onda, for that very clear discussion. Also, emphasizing also some of your research efforts on microbes and climate change. So thank you very much. We shall now proceed to our open forum. So we would like to request our speakers, Academician Pulhin, Dr. TG, Dr. Aviso, Dr. De Los Reyes, and Dr. Onda, if you can open your camera. May be difficult for Dr. Onda, but we would like to begin with our open forum. Okay, we've noted that some of the questions on the Q&A box have been answered, but for the benefit of those watching on Facebook, we would like to request our speakers to reply to those questions once again. Okay, so let's have the first question. We receive a question from Angelo Dionisio, and he says, my question is on biologically dead rivers as to its current situation and present count. How many of these are already identified locally and globally? And we would like to pursue our watershed protection project in schools, asking if we can plant mangroves along riverbanks or whatever suited trees for this initiative. So anyone who would like to comment on this? Maybe Academician Pauline?
Yes, I'm not an expert on river basins, but we work quite extensively in the Philippines on river basins. However, if you talk about biologically dead river, then essentially it's where life forms can no longer exist. And so it's very easy to point out that if you rank the different rivers of the world, then Ganges River in India and also part of Bangladesh top the lists. I've also worked in Indonesia. It's in Citarum River, and also that has even part of it, not the whole, the whole range is also considered as biologically dead. In the Philippines, there are indications that Pasig River is one of those, although there has been a significant attempt to revive that. But of course, that's one of on the top of the list as far as polluted rivers that cannot support life is concerned. There are probably other local rivers that we are not very much familiar of, but just let me respond though. It's a good effort if the school will be part in watershed rehabilitation, but I would caution though that it's important with what we call as species site matching. Meaning to say, it's very important that whatever tree species you will be planting will be suitable to the locality. And the rule of thumb is what used to be growing in the area should be the first priority. And also know as much as possible the exotic species. Because when you talk about, for instance, Bakawan, that's actually a mangrove species. So you can plant it at the mouth of the river, but not necessarily it will not grow in the upstream. So just a little caution on this. But again, thank you so much for the question, and we really encourage and thank you for your effort for harnessing the potential of schools to be partner in riverbank rehabilitation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Academician Pulhin. Okay, another question this time from Grace Gabisay. Probably Dr. TG or even Dr. De Los Reyes can answer these questions. What are the rules and regulations governing the use of microbes for industrial use, climate change mitigation, agricultural use, and other uses? Who can use this? What about their commercialization and nature or instructions for use and safety for the Philippine setting?
So I can't answer for the Philippine setting, but in the U.S., if it is a natural organism from nature, it can be used. I'm not sure the scale that it can be used before there might be some regulatory considerations.
Oh, thank you, Dr. TG. Dr. De Los Reyes?
As far as I know, and maybe others would know more about this, it's the same situation in the Philippines, right? We haven't really regulated, natural microorganisms. Of course, when we talk about genetically modified microorganisms and releasing them to the environment, then there are regulations there. Especially in terms of research and obviously for commercial uses. But it's the same situation in the US, I think, in terms of natural microorganisms.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay. A question from Dr. Franco Teves. The projections caused by global warming are alarming. A 50-year modeling shows that many regions in the world will become deserts, including a big chunk of China, Africa, and Australia, among others. Food and water security will certainly be impacted, yet there seems to be little activity in terms of preparations, including more R&D on drought-resistant, heat-resistant food crops. What would be your recommendations regarding worsening food security issues caused by global warming? Dr. TG?
Yeah, I think a big factor here is the migration of people. If it becomes unsustainable from a point of food and water, people will move. And I do know that so one group in the U.S. that tries to think strategically long term is the military. And I know they have been thinking about this because it would cause great instability in the world. I'm not sure, other than a group like that, if someone is really planning that far ahead for that particular problem. So that's sort of the worst case situation. But I do think that I know that there has been research going on for some time in a number of countries to try to develop drought tolerant or environmentally tolerant plants or crops because it takes a long period of time. It takes 20 or 30 years to come up with something that is suitable for that kind of stress situation. So that's why it has begun early. And I do know also that some of this research includes work with microbes that have an effect or favor or aid plants in a drought situation.
Thank you. Dr. Onda?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that. Probably just to expand a bit on the discussion point, I think in the context of the Philippines, climate change will also affect food security because increasing sea surface temperature will strengthen stratification, and that would also mean less nutrients actually being upwelled or being brought into the surface, and thus would lead to less productivity of the surface waters, resulting in less food for the fish, and therefore fisheries sector will be affected. And I think for the Philippines, it is very best of interest to understand what parts of the country are now being affected and will be affected in the future. By looking at ecology of microorganisms, basically in the phytoplankton, we'll be able to see trajectories on what countries or what regions of the country will be most vulnerable to the effects of sea surface warming, which would then cause collapse probably of the fisheries industry. And this will allow us to probably come up with management system and mitigation strategies, identify which parts of the country are most vulnerable and identify which parts of the country can actually become alternative. This certain conditions can be understood through microbial ecology. But the problem right now is that there's big perception that microbial ecology is not a tool. Actually, by understanding the ecology of the microbes itself allows us to understand the trajectory of these ecosystems and then the economic implications to the country. So I hope there's also a big shift from having very applied research to basic ecology being a tool to understanding these trajectories. Those are just some of my sentiments. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Onda. Academician Pulhin.
Yes, thank you so much. I had the privilege to be part of the sixth assessment report in Asia, and I was assigned actually on the section on food security. And one of the key overarching observations on our analysis is the differentiated impacts among and within specific countries. So as pointed out by Dr. Ona, we have winners and losers. And so it's very, very important to look at that. And I agree also with Dr. Tebes in terms of strategic. And this is where now our foresight thinking comes in. And that's why NAST has its own foresight paper that tries to capture also climate change. That's very, very important. But understanding the issue of food security can be best appreciated by looking at different scales. So at the plot level or field level, then certainly technologies may play a role, such as flood-resistant, drought-resistant varieties, and so on. So science is very crucial for that. No, but at the same time, when we talk about food security, we also talk about access. No, and that's where now it becomes problematic because it's now an intersection of the issue of climate change with other factors like economics and so on. And a good example of, for instance, with the Ukraine and Russian war, and then we have problem in terms of food supply and so on and so forth. So what we're saying, therefore, is it's really a complicated issue, but that needs foresight thinking, and we need to understand it at different scales, from the household to the community to the regional, and that's why even the issue of trade comes into play because many countries who will be losing their arable lands have now start to negotiate as early as this time with other countries in terms of trade relations. So it's really good to look at it at different dimensions, but the overarching conclusion is to deal with it in an integrated manner. So you have the science and technology, you have the governance, you have the trade, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Academician Pulhin. Okay, we have a question for Dr. Aviso from Academician Raimundo. How can you factor in microbial processes in your models?
Thank you so much for that question. So yeah, it is really an opportunity to collaborate with different experts and, because the insights that can be gained from those who really understand the microbial processes will be very beneficial in building our models. So like I mentioned, in one of our recent work, we're actually collaborating now with biologists, so that we can better understand the different interactions and roles played by other species within the ecosystem. So in the same way, we can also use this kind of framework of collaborating with experts who know more about microbial processes, so that we can adequately represent them in the process models.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question from Dr. Rina Opolencia. Probably Dr. TG or Dr. De Los Reyes can answer this. While methane is a potent greenhouse gas, it is also a renewable energy source. Can you discuss the challenges in tapping methane into clean energy? Can we soon rely completely on methane as energy source?
So I would say no, that we can't rely completely on methane as a clean energy source. We should use it where it's feasible to use it, because it is a good energy source. It also leaks from other sources, so that's also a problem in greenhouse warming. Is the inefficient use of it, or the leaks, I guess, that occur in a number of locations. But my big point is we use it where we can, and we probably can increase the use of, or the production of methane, but it's not going to be a major energy source.
Thank you, Dr. TG. Okay, additional point from Dr. Aviso.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I just want to emphasize what Dr. TG already mentioned. So we already know that methane is a greenhouse gas, but it's correct. We cannot use this as a major source for our energy, because even though it has, when you combust methane, eventually it also still generates carbon dioxide in the process. So it's not entirely zero emissions.
Thank you for that. Okay, we have another question from Dr. Franco Teves, I see the urgency to focus more effort on R&D in using microbes, especially in the management of greenhouse gases. One problem I see is that for this pathway to succeed, very massive and global concerted efforts are needed. The question is on how we can implement such kind of R&D program on a global scale.
No.
Dr. PG?
Yes. Okay. I would say that so there's two parts of that. One is an R&D program at the global scale. The other is how to actually implement it into practical use. On the latter, I would say we probably need better ways in which to disseminate research information to get it utilized more broadly. So that's not for the typical scientist, more of the social scientist, I guess, has an important role to play there.
Thank you. Academician Pulhin.
Yes, I fully agree with Professor TG when he said that, well, my term is scientific advocacy because as he rightly pointed out at the start of his talk, I also, when invited by academician Raimundo in this talk, the first thing was I searched on the work of IPCC. And truly, there is not much there. But I remember also how a group of scientists actually advocated, so to speak, a certain topic. On the fifth assessment report, if you look at, I'm just citing it as an example, the chapter on climate change and human security, if you look at the earlier assessment reports, there is hardly or very limited mentions about that. But there was a very quite strong group, research group also, I think from Europe and other countries, that really done a lot of, there was, before the assessment report, an explosion, so to speak, of publication that advocated for that. But at the same time, I say on the sideline, advocacy, scientific advocacy, highlighting the importance of that particular topic. And so I think the same can be done at IPCC from the endpoint of the users. We can see that and I personally believe that there is a good opportunity, a good space for there, a wide room of opportunities for this type of work to be incorporated. So it's really probably strategizing among key researchers and coming up with high impact publications that will catch the attentions of the IPCC.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have a question for Dr. Abiso from Grace Gabisay on the process model graph that you have shown earlier. A rice culture, crayfish, shrimp culture might need to shift to their culture of fertilization of these crops. And would the fish waste be enough to obtain optimum yield for the rice?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So these are also some co-benefits that can be realized when you implement co-culture systems. There is the possibility that you actually reduce the amount of nutrients needed, the chemical fertilizers needed to grow the crops properly. So for the model that we presented, the information was actually based on the data from a previous publication by Dong and colleagues, which are Chinese researchers. And in their work, they did not include any inputs from the external to the system. But yeah, if we want to implement these systems, of course, we need to see really how much we need to adjust in terms of fertilizer use.
Thank you, Dr. Abiso. Okay, on the chat box, we have a comment from academician Maala, and you may want to comment on this. The nature of food ruminants, which is rich in fibers, favors the production of gases like methane in large volume. These gases have to be expelled out from the rumen so that the animals will not get sick. Bloat is one problem arising from accumulation of gases in the rumen. If untreated, bloat will result to death of the animal. Thank you. Dr. De Los Reyes.
Yeah, so that is correct, but I think most of the gas is really hydrogen, right, which is a product of fermentation, and that's inevitable because basically that's what the rumen does. It ferments, cellulose to acids, and in that process you produce H2. The acids are taken up by the epithelial cells of the rumen. That's how the cow gets the food. And so in terms of thinking about that, you can think about how the H2 can be used as electron donor, for example, increasing other acids, propionate, for example, right? And so in that way, you do reduce the H2 partial pressure inside the rumen. Of course, the other pathway is through methane, but then you produce gas and another gas. And this is why you get the 27% of methane is actually coming from ruminants. And I understand it's really not coming, I guess, I'm not an animal scientist, but my understanding is that it's not really coming out on the back end. It's coming out on the front end of the cow as burps rather than as farts on the other side. So just a little fact that I learned.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Francis. Okay, I don't see any more questions in our Q&A box, also in our chat box. So in the next few minutes, maybe we can discuss the questions posed by Dr. De Los Reyes earlier to the other speakers. So you may directly ask your questions, Dr. Francis.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the most interesting question for me is for Dr. TG, is basically this concept of microbial injustice. And really, are there, it's a new concept. It's not really new because we kind of know about it, but putting a name to it and then asking, are there any studies in that area? Because that sounds very applicable to the Philippines, where there are already all kinds of inequities. But then if you look at it from the microbial standpoint, that's an even more, not just interesting, but very applicable phenomenon that we probably need to think about in the country. But I guess the question is, do you have you seen cases, projects, research programs that look at this?
No, I have not, but that's not my expertise either. But I do think that giving it a name, like microbial injustice, is very helpful, in stimulating some action. And I think the first action would be to gather the data, and then one understands what to focus on.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you have other questions, Dr. Francis?
I mean, the others are more of policy-related questions, and I think we always ask ourselves, how can we scale up or publicize some of these success stories to our policymakers, to our the people who control the budgets, the research budgets, and it's really more of how we as scientists educate our legislators and people who control the money to say, okay, we need research, like Dr. Onda was saying, we need research so we can not just connect the dots, but actually show you how we can address some of these challenges. So I guess one question is, I don't know, how do we, I guess this also for Academician Pulin or Dr. TJ, what's your experience in terms of putting this in the forefront, microbes and climate change? And do you have experience in presenting this to, this issue to legislators and lawmakers and policymakers?
So I don't have experience on this particular topic, but I did get a great education from the physicists when I was involved with a big project they wanted to do. And this had to do with neutrinos. And when it needed a deep underground science facility, it cost a huge amount of money. So they were trying to gather other fields that might be interested in what else could be done with such a facility. And microbes from the point of view of being very deep in the earth and how they live and how that might affect their evolution and so forth. But anyway, from that I learned how they organize. And they try to be unified. And they try to deal with conflicts so that everybody's on the same page. Because they say what politicians don't like is when there's disagreement. Because then they're reluctant to spend money. But if everybody agrees and that they can show some big outcome, whether it's practical or even fundamental, then they're more likely to get the money. And they did a very effective job at meeting with, as they call it, all their clients, with the different political groups and the government agencies and so forth, to see what their concerns were and to try to address them. And they got a very big project. So that's one kind of approach, is the strategy to unify. And I can certainly see how that logically works at the political level.
Thank you, Dr. TG. Academician Pauline, you have any comments?
Yes, I don't have specific experience on this topic, but I have been in other topics. I think the issue of really strengthening science policy interlinkages is really very, very central and at the core of the challenge associated with us as scientists. So our approach has always been to work with champions, and even with the issue of climate change itself in the Philippines, and a number of us were actually managed to provide some technical assistance to the crafting of the Climate Change Act of 2009 in the country. And that is by working with the champions. We always look at politicians who have keen interest on the topic and who can champion as a specific, again, scientific advocacy that we generate from our researches. So during that time, it was then former senator and now still a new senator, Lauren Legarda, whom we work with. And if you are able to convince a number of them, then essentially you need not actually, our experience is you need not run after them. They will run after you if they can see the potential contribution of that. Because good science, I believe, would also be good politics. So in a way, that's at least on this issue of climate change, that's our experience. So even at the local, we always, even in our research, we engage even local decision makers in our local research. So we are now, for instance, looking at payment for ecosystem services in watershed areas. Then we are working with local LGUs and so on for local ordinances and hopefully also at the national level. So working with champions is really a key, I believe.
Thank you, Academician Pauline.
So
Okay,
another point
Okay.
I would offer on this particular topic is I saw recently that, I mean, as we know, there are some climate change skeptics, but the point of this group was not focus on that. And this was an agricultural setting or an agriculture issue. And they were saying that what farmers know is that there has been more severe weather. And so that is the issue, to deal with more severe weather and avoid, the top, whether or not you believe in climate change.
Thank you, Dr. TG. Okay, so before we close this open forum, we received a comment from academician Rodor Asansa. Let me just read this comment. Harmful algal blooms, microalgae, and macroalgae have been considered most recently as responses to climate change. For example, the journal Sustainability of the MDPI has invited me as guest editor from November 2022 to December 2023 to have a focused discussion, publications on this topic, and its links to food security from aquatic environment. Thank you very much, Academician Asansa, for that comment. Okay, so I guess this ends our open forum. Thank you once again to our speakers, Academician Putin, Dr. TG, Dr. Aviso, Dr. De Reyes, and Dr. Deo Onda. Okay, we'd like to document this. We ask our speakers, our discussants, also our rapporteurs to turn on the cameras for a group photo, and the NAS Secretariat will be taking our photo. Please give us a cue.
I'll count to 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, so we'd like now to have the synthesis of our discussion. To deliver the synthesis of our discussions this morning, let me call on Dr. Pierangeli G. Vital, Outstanding Young Scientist of 2021, also University Researcher, Scientist 1 in the Scientific Career System of the Department of Science and Technology, also Civil Service Commission. She's also the head of the Biological Research and Services Laboratory at the Natural Sciences Research Institute of UP Diliman. Well, Dr. Vital also served as ASEAN Science and Technology Fellow for 2019 and also 2020 under the ASEAN Foundation and USAID. She was also Senior Scientist Research Fellow in 2017 under the Department of Agriculture, Bureau of Agricultural Research. She's conferred as Diplomate of the Philippine Academy of Microbiology and recently received distinctions as the 2022 Gawad Chancellor para sa Natatanging Reps Research Category, featured as 2021 Cohort of Southeast Asia Women, and the 2020 Outstanding ASEAN Science Diplomat. Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Pai, please.
Thank you very much po, Academician Wendell. Good morning po to our resource speakers, NAS members in microbe and climate change experts and enthusiasts. I am assigned to provide synthesis for our focus group discussion on microbes and climate change. The NAS host division for this FGD is the Biological Sciences Division, with lead coordinator who also gave the overview of the FGD, Academician Asuncion Raimundo, and members Academician Wendell Rivera, Academician Virginia Cuevas, and corresponding member Francis de los Reyes III in collaboration with the Microbiology Consortium of the Philippines. And based on this FGD's concept note, the rationale of this FGD is that coping with this changing planet is perhaps the greatest challenge humanity is confronted with in the 21st century and beyond. And stronger typhoons, erratic rainfall patterns, rising coastal water levels, frequent wildfires, animal migration, which has been mentioned also during our discussion, more destructive epidemics, and many more disturbing occurrences have emerged. And all of these have been attributed to climate change, which is precipitated by global warming. And of course, microorganisms, as the most abundant and ubiquitous life form on Earth, play an important role in climate regulation, as they are major drivers of elemental cycling, such as those mentioned also earlier, carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur, as well as key pathogens of humans, animals, and plants. And human activities, especially agriculture and transport systems, have greatly disturbed the balance of elemental cycling, resulting in the release of more GHGs, again, which we have learned this morning, to the environment, exacerbating global warming, contributing to climate change. And the Philippines, particularly, due to its geographical location and as an archipelagic country, is considered as one of the most vulnerable countries in the world affected by climate change, and it's therefore necessary for us to understand the role of microbes or the importance of microbes in climate change as we undertake adaptive and mitigating measures, hence is FGD. And the general objective of the FGD, as mentioned by Academician Azanza in her welcome remarks, that microbes are rarely discussed as drivers of climate change, is to help targeted stakeholders become aware of the role of microbes in climate change and factor them in their research and models in policies. Our first speaker, Academician Pulhin, a member of the Social Sciences Division and co-chair task force on climate change, discussed updates on climate change. His talk focused on the ecosystems that focus on human impacts, and his talk is divided into three parts. The first one being climate change for the global and the regional outlook, focusing on observed and projected impact of climate both at the global and local levels. And he also mentioned that based on IPCC report that climate change caused substantial damages in all ecosystems such as water scarcity and food production, human well-being, city settlement, and infrastructure with high confidence or significance. Second part of his talk is on the new insights on in climate change, where he mentioned that there is confounding and cascading risk of climate change anticipated to have adverse impacts to environment, human and animals, increasing incidence and intensification of extreme weather coupled with slow onset impacts of climate change that will heighten involuntary migration and displacement, and the limits to adaptation are being breached already in different places across the world. This has been mentioned several times, the losses and damages happening globally, which are projected to increase dramatically, and only rapid mitigation and effective adaptation can prevent climate-induced losses and damages. So the third part of his talk is on the climate change, particularly in Southeast Asia and the Philippines, and he enumerated the observed climate change impacts first in Asia, with, of course, attributed CIDs. And the context now in the Philippines, he mentioned that it's even dimmer. Out of more than 190 countries from year 2000 to 2019, the country ranked fourth, and more than a mere environmental challenge. Climate change has been an economic, especially those to poverty-stricken communities or individuals, social, political, and security issue with food, health, in relation, of course, to microbial diseases, topic of our FGD, that will contribute to expose vulnerabilities across sectors in the Philippines if nothing drastic solution will be done. Again, that is emphasized. First, we move on to our second speaker, Dr. James T.G., University Distinguished Professor, and he discussed on the microbes and climate change and overall perspective. And of course, seen on the screen is his main message to us. So he emphasized the opportunity and the need for microbiologists to contribute to knowledge, to climate change actions also. And he discussed 3 GHGs and how these are produced and consumed by microbes, including the types of microbes. The first one being carbon dioxide, or what are the roles of microbes in this GHG, such as microbes oxidize organic carbon in soil tillage, deforestation, waste treatment, permafrost, and biofuel. He also gave examples, and of course, as microbiologists, you already know this in terms of production consumption, heterotrophic bacteria, fungi, and protozoa, and for consumption, of course, autotrophic microorganisms. Second GHG is methane, marine sectors of microbial production in landfills, manure management, and enteric fermentation. Of course, a third gas is nitrous oxide, should depend upon the management of soil coming from nitrification and denitrification. He mentioned that the second and third gases can be looked at or targeted, as this could increase to control climate change, with methane as the best to be targeted. He also mentioned main categories of climate change impact based on the report of AAM, which is very much in relation to the one discussed by our first resource speaker, which are terrestrial, aquatic, urban, human health and well-being, models and systems, and bioeconomy. Of course, methane being example again would be methanogens, and for consumption would be methanotrophs. And he also mentioned for the N2 or nitrogen also. Then many models that show an integrated system, such as terrestrial, population growth, the travel, which affect the growth and the type of microorganisms. He gave particular examples, which he discussed in detail also. And he also mentioned different modeling and deep learning approaches which led to the discussion of our third speaker. He also gave concrete examples where he has been involved, such as in Ghana, the Amazon rainforest, showing that soil management is really important, including the microbes, as well as, of course, the North and the South Greenland. So he emphasized the importance to study microbial processes in detail to know which are important, and of course he presented different recommendations. We move on to our third speaker, Dr. Kathleen Aviso, and she talked about network models for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Not really an expert into modeling, but just to summarize, of course, the talk of Dr. Aviso, how network models can help and how microbes can play a role in these network models affecting or giving an impact to SDG number 2, which is zero hunger, and SDG number 13, climate change. Her talk is divided basically into 3 parts, the fourth being the conclusion. The first is on the vicious cycle and networks, emphasizing on the interrelatedness of climate change with other species and the limiting factors in production, such as land, water, and nutrient footprints, including climate change impacts, logistics, human resources, network effects in agricultural systems, and an example would be the counterintuitive network effects. And then she mentioned, of course, on the second part of her talk, the different process graph models. The third one, she gave examples on the engineered co-culture systems, such as the rice paddy co-culture system, particularly the rice crayfish co-culture. And then she gave, of course, the insights and the different conclusions mentioned also and shown on the screen. Then we had discussants, Dr. De Los Reyes and Dr. Anda. You can see the emphasis that they given, particularly on the questions faced by Dr. De Los Reyes, and Dr. Anda mentioned that there are very few studies in the Philippines, opening up, of course, more studies later on. And I believe I remember Dr. TG mentioning the role of the next generation or the younger generation to help in the study. So with that, allow me to leave just this keyword, micro, with 5 letters only. M, of course, for microorganisms or the microbes. I is to incorporate the microbes or microbial sciences in current and future climate change initiatives and remediation processes to lessen the impact of climate change to our lives. C, of course, climate change. R for recommendations, policy recommendations. And O as an overview, or this FGD is just the start of our discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vital, for that very good synthesis of our discussion this morning. We also would like to thank our rapporteur, Dr. Glenn L. Shiasu, professor at the Department of Biology in UP Manila. Now, to formally close this event, let us all welcome academician Virginia C. Cuevas, member of the Biological Sciences Division of NAS Philippines. Academician Cuevas, you are still muted.
esteemed colleagues in the academy, our distinguished resource persons, discussants, and participants from public and private institutions, magandang tanghali. We have just finished a 3-hour discussion on the role of microorganisms, the most abundant and diverse life forms on Earth, on climate change. The presentations are clear, updates and discussions are informative and very enlightening. Microorganisms affect climate change in the same manner climate change affects microbial processes. The Q&A portion is very lively and interesting. I hope everybody learns how microorganisms are in I hope everybody learns how microorganisms role in regulating climate change. We need to harness their potentials and manage processes that will lessen the inputs of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide inputs to the atmosphere. We have to promote, especially in agriculture, practices to sequester and store more carbon and reduce methane production so we do not exceed the 1.5 degrees centigrade increase in global temperature. We need to factor in microbial science in climate change modeling and crafting policies for adaptive measures to lessen the impact of climate change in our lives. We urgently need these measures since the Philippines is the 4th most vulnerable country in the world affected by climate change. As Dr. T.G. and Dr. De Los Reyes emphasized, there is a need for interdisciplinary research to generate knowledge and awareness of the contributions of microbes to GHG production and minimize them. We'll have more discussion of this on the second FGD in the series. I learned several new terms such as microbial injustice, and there is minimal publication on climate change and microorganisms in journal articles, and there was an analysis why this is so. And there is a very good saying, small size, big roles. On behalf of the National Academy of Science Philippines, I'd like to thank everyone for sharing with us your valuable time in this activity. This session is the first of the 3-part series of focus group discussions on microbes and climate change. Allow me to thank resource persons, Dr. James T.G., Academician Juan Polin, Dr. Kathleen Alviso, Dr. Deo Lawrence Onda, Responding Member Francis De Los Reyes III, Dr. Pai Vital, and Dr. Glenn Shasu for the insights and knowledge that you have imparted to us. I'd like to acknowledge the leadership of Academician Asuncion K. Raimundo in organizing this series of FGDs on microbes and climate change, and the assistance of Academician Wendell Rivera and corresponding member Francis De Los Reyes. I'd like also to recognize representatives from various sectors, both public and private, for virtual participating in this activity. Once again, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you in the next sessions of this FGD in the series, which will explain in more detail the topics presented today on microbes and climate change. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Academician Cuevas. Now, before we close this session, we would like to announce that NAST Philippines will launch the publication Paghahanda Pilipinas, Strategic Initiatives on Pandemic Preparedness and Response as part of the opening day of the 2022 National Science and Technology Week on November 23, 2022 at the World Trade Center in Pasay City. The Paghahanda Pilipinas Strategic Initiatives for Pandemic Preparedness and Response synthesizes the transdisciplinary discussions during the 2021 Regional Scientific Meetings and 43rd Annual Scientific Meeting of NAST Philippines. The publication and the 43rd ASM resolutions were developed from the invaluable insights and recommendations of the invited resource persons, government leaders, and scientists. The two documents are envisioned as complementary references in promoting pandemic preparedness, addressing different sectoral and multidisciplinary issues brought by the pandemic, and influencing legislators, decision makers, and planners at all levels of government and concerned sectors of society. The book launch, which will be held during the 2022 NSTW Awards and the DOST Intellectual Property Awards, will be broadcasted on the NAST Philippines and NSTW Facebook pages. After its launch, the digital copy of the book will be available for download at the NAST Philippines website. So please keep posted for more information on the online broadcast of the event by visiting the NAST Philippines social media platforms. Kindly answer our short survey before leaving these FGD. Participants who accomplish the evaluation form are entitled to receive a certificate of attendance. So please follow NAS official Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram accounts flashed on your screens. So in behalf of the NAS Philippines and the Microbiology Consortium of the Philippines, thank you very much for joining us this morning. It has been my pleasure to serve as your host for this activity. Once again, thank you and see you in the next discussions.
Thank you, everyone.
Welcome to the Philippine Science Heritage Center's new Salinlahi Science Center, honoring our top Filipino scientists and their game-changing contributions to the world of science. Know more about all of them and let the Salinlahi Science Center be your gateway into their minds. Salinlahi,